In March 1943, the Germans simply walked away from a fortress the Soviets had bled for 14 months to capture. They abandoned a position 120 miles from Moscow that had consumed over 2 million casualties. They freed 22 divisions by choice rather than defeat. The entire year-long battle revealed itself as a monument to pointless slaughter. This is the story of the Rzhev Salient, a meat grinder that devoured armies, a battle that killed on a scale matching Stalingrad, yet remains unknown to history, a strategic obsession that consumed millions of lives for positions the enemy would surrender voluntarily. This is the story of what happens when fear, pride, and fortified defense collide in a year-long catastrophe. The veterans called it the Rzhevskaya Myasorubka, the meat grinder. A campaign so catastrophic that even Marshal Zhukov would later admit we overestimated ourselves and underestimated the enemies. By early 1942, Soviet forces had pushed the Germans back from Moscow's gates. The winter counteroffensive had saved the capital, but victory had created something far more dangerous than a simple front line. The Soviet winter offensive of 1941 to 1942 had pushed German forces westward in an irregular pattern. The attack created a massive bulge in the front lines. This bulge protruded eastward from the German positions. It pointed like a weapon directly at the Soviet capital. The town of Rzhev sat at the heart of this salient, approximately 140 miles west of Moscow. That distance represented less than 2 days of mechanized advance under good conditions. The salient faced east toward Moscow, offering the German Army Group Center a base from which they could theoretically launch future offensives against the capital. General Georgy Zhukov looked at this bulge and saw an existential threat. He characterized the German position as a dagger pointed at Moscow. That phrase would define Soviet strategic thinking for the next year. Zhukov convinced Stalin that the Moscow axis was the most critical sector of the entire Eastern Front. He argued that Army Group Center posed the greatest threat to the Soviet Union, not the forces in the south fighting toward the Caucasus oil fields, not the armies besieging Leningrad. The threat was here, 120 miles from the Kremlin, in the fortified positions around Rzhev. Stalin accepted this assessment completely. The proximity to Moscow transformed what should have been a tactical concern into a strategic obsession. The Soviet leader had watched German forces reach the outskirts of his capital just months earlier. He had seen the spires of the Kremlin within range of German artillery. The psychological weight of that threat never lifted. The salient represented unfinished business. It represented danger. Most importantly, it represented a challenge that Stalin could not ignore. But if this dagger was so threatening to the Soviets, why were the Germans equally determined to hold it at any cost? The Germans understood exactly what Zhukov had convinced Stalin to fear. They were prepared to turn that fear into a killing ground. General Walter Model commanded the German 9th Army defending the salient. Model was arguably the Wehrmacht's finest defensive tactician, and he transformed the position into a fortress unlike anything else on the Eastern Front. His engineers constructed multiple defensive belts, each with trenches, bunkers, and overlapping artillery positions. The terrain itself became a weapon. The unusually wet summer turned low-lying areas into swamps, with villages constructed on higher ground converted into fortified strongpoints. Soviet accounts described what Model built in terrifying detail. Solid minefields stretched across approach routes. Networks of bunkers dotted the landscape. Barbed wire was laid out in dense lines that seemed to go on forever. Each village was linked by trench systems that allowed defenders to shift positions under cover. Behind every defensive line waited another defensive line. Model employed what the Germans called elastic defense, allowing limited Soviet advances before counterattacking with mobile reserves positioned to strike at penetrating forces from multiple directions. But Model's real innovation was intelligence and fire coordination. He established a headquarters called Harko 307 to manage approximately 260 medium artillery pieces. These guns had pre-planned engagement zones covering all critical sectors of the front. Forward observers linked by field telephones could concentrate devastating fire to disrupt Soviet infantry assaults before they ever breached German lines. Model could see attacks developing and mass firepower against them with remarkable speed. Despite Hitler's explicit prohibition on fallback positions, Model quietly constructed fortified switch lines in his rear, giving his forces places to fall back to if any sector was overwhelmed. The German commitment to defending this single sector was staggering. They ultimately deployed 29 divisions to hold the salient. 29 divisions represented roughly 300,000 men, supported by over 300 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces. This was a massive allocation of forces to a single defensive position. These were not garrison troops or second-rate units. These were frontline divisions that could have been used elsewhere on the vast Eastern Front. The Germans judged the strategic value of the salient worth this enormous commitment. The defensive philosophy at Rzhev was brutally simple: hold every position, contest every meter. Make the Soviets pay in blood for every advance. Every Soviet division attacking Rzhev was a division not attacking somewhere else. Every casualty the Soviets suffered here was a soldier who could not fight in Ukraine or the Caucasus. The fortress would serve Germany by consuming Soviet strength, even if it never launched a single offensive operation. The German soldiers defending Rzhev understood what was at stake. They knew that if the salient fell, the road to Smolensk would open. They knew that Army Group Center could be outflanked and destroyed. They fought with the desperation of men who believed they were the last line of defense between the Red Army and the heart of occupied Europe. Whether that belief was strategically accurate or not, it drove them to hold positions long after any rational calculation would have called for retreat. Just days into 1942, before the snow had even settled on the German retreat from Moscow, Zhukov launched the first assault on what he had convinced Stalin was the greatest threat to the Soviet Union. The Rzhev-Vyazma offensive launched on January 8, 1942. The operation marked the beginning of what would become a 14-month campaign. Zhukov commanded the Western Front during this operation. He personally drove the attack that would set the pattern for all future assaults. The offensive represented Soviet strategic thinking at its most direct. The Germans held a position threatening Moscow. Therefore, that position must be eliminated through offensive action. The cost was secondary to the objective. Soviet forces attacked throughout January. They attacked through February. They attacked through March. The offensive continued into April. 4 months of continuous combat. 4 months of assaults against fortified positions. 4 months of casualties mounting with every attack. The pattern established itself immediately and would repeat endlessly for the next year. Soviet infantry would advance against German positions. German defenders would open fire from prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. Soviet forces would suffer massive casualties. The survivors would retreat to reorganize. Artillery would bombard German positions, sometimes for hours. Then the infantry would attack again across the same ground, stepping over the bodies of comrades who had fallen in previous waves. The fortifications model had built proved their worth from the first day. Soviet forces could not break through the defensive lines in any meaningful way. Penetrations were local and temporary. German counterattacks would seal any breach before it could be exploited. The defensive depth meant that even successful attacks against the first line accomplished nothing strategically. Behind every German position was another position. Behind every defensive line was another line. The fortress absorbed every blow and remained standing. By April 20th, 1942, when the offensive finally ended, the strategic situation remained essentially unchanged. The Germans still held Rzhev. The salient still protruded toward Moscow. Model's fortress still dominated the landscape. The only difference was the casualty count. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had died or been wounded attacking positions that remained firmly in German hands. 6 months after the winter offensive ground to a halt, Stalin's conviction that Rzhev was the critical sector had only intensified. This time, he would commit not 1 but 2 front commanders to break Model's fortress. The first Rzhev-Sykyovka offensive launched in late July 1942. Zhukov commanded the Western Front. General Ivan Konev commanded the Kalinin Front. 2 front commanders, 2 separate axes of attack. Over 500,000 troops and more than 1,000 tanks were committed to a coordinated offensive designed to overwhelm Model's defenses through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. In the early morning hours of August 4, 1942, Zhukov unleashed a massive preliminary bombardment. A concentration of artillery and mortars along a narrow front rained down shells and bombs on German positions for nearly 90 minutes. Then came a pause. Soviet aircraft laid smoke along the front line, but this lull was a ruse designed to lure German defenders back into their forward trenches. The final crescendo followed, topped by devastating volleys from Katyusha rocket launchers that turned the landscape into an inferno. The energy of the firestorm destroyed German wire entanglements in many places. Bunkers and fixed positions lay smashed. Soviet rifle divisions crossed the swollen Derza River on rafts, boats, and ferries, securing the forward German line within an hour and with comparatively small losses. It seemed like the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for was finally happening. The 16th Guards Rifle Division in the center overran the forward trenches in the first hour. They captured the fortified villages of the second position soon after. By 1 in the afternoon, its men were deep in the German rear and already approaching the village of Polunino halfway to Rzhev itself. To its right, the 379th and 111th Rifle Divisions also smashed into the German front line, penetrating through and capturing 4 batteries of German divisional artillery. Then, Model's defensive system activated, and everything changed. Behind the shattered front line, the Germans had prepared secondary defensive positions outside Rzhev, and a final belt of defenses on the town's outskirts. The supporting Soviet tanks were lagging behind the infantry, many mired in the thick mud. The riflemen had come up against prepared German lines, and upon digging in, found their trenches immediately filled with water. The counterattacks began. The constant attacks exhausted German troops, but they held their ground with desperate determination. Infantry Regiment 481 was reduced to just 120 fighting men. They were attached to Kampfgruppe Mummert, a battle group thrown together from fragments of 4 different divisions. When Soviet tanks overran their trenches, German infantry used bundled grenades and mines, attacks requiring extraordinary individual daring and often resulting in the deaths of the men who carried them out. By late August, the offensive had produced 290,000 Soviet casualties for minimal territorial gain. Model demanded reinforcements until the 9th Army commanded 25 divisions, half of Army Group Center's total strength, including 20 infantry divisions, 4 panzer divisions, and the elite Großdeutschland division. What happened next remained hidden from Western historians for half a century. Operation Mars launched on November 25, 1942. This was the same day Soviet forces completed their encirclement at Stalingrad. Most people assume Stalingrad was the main Soviet offensive that winter. Historian David Glantz later argued this was completely wrong. Mars was intended to be the primary Soviet offensive of winter 1942 to 1943, designed to collapse the entire German Army Group Center and advance towards Smolensk and beyond. Zhukov deployed over 700,000 assault troops and 1,620 tanks against Model's 350,000 defenders. The attacks came from all sides of the salient simultaneously in what was supposed to be a crushing blow that would annihilate the German 9th Army. But Model had weeks of warning. Inadequate Soviet operational security allowed German intelligence to identify the coming attack sectors well in advance. Model concentrated his defenses accordingly and positioned his panzer reserves for devastating counterattacks. The offensive achieved initial penetrations in several sectors. Along the Vazouza River, Soviet mobile forces advanced 12 kilometers and severed the Sychevka-Rzhev railway line. It seemed like encirclement was possible, but Konev failed to expand the breach in the German front. His best units stretched thin in a narrow salient, vulnerable to counterattack. Then, Model struck back with overwhelming force. On November 29th, the 5th and 9th Panzer Divisions counterattacked from both flanks. They encircled Konev's mobile group and destroyed it in a classic Kessel battle, the German term for a cauldron encirclement. Thousands of Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped behind German lines. The trapped Soviets fought for weeks in the German rear. Some managed to break through to Soviet lines after desperate battles. Most did not. They had to abandon almost all of their vehicles and heavy weapons. Those who surrendered faced uncertain fates. Those who continued fighting were hunted down. The casualties from Operation Mars were staggering. 335,000 Soviet dead, wounded, and missing. 800 tanks destroyed or damaged, all for no strategic gain whatsoever. The losses exceeded those of many famous battles that everyone remembers. Yet Mars vanished from history while Stalingrad became legend. The irony was brutal. At the exact moment Soviet forces were achieving the greatest encirclement victory of the war at Stalingrad, they were simultaneously suffering one of their worst defeats at Rzhev. The same Stavka, the same high command, was running both operations. The same marshal, Zhukov, had his name attached to both. One became the turning point of the war in every history book. The other became a secret buried so deep that Western historians would not fully uncover it for 50 years. For 3 grueling weeks, Operation Mars was one of the most tragic and agonizing episodes in Soviet military history. Fought in bad weather and on impossible terrain, the offensive faltered despite spectacular initial success in some sectors. Zhukov kept sending in more troops and tanks only to see them decimated by the entrenched Germans. The forests, mud, fog, freezing temperatures, and raging snowstorms of Western Russia consumed division after division. Zhukov later reflected on what went wrong. He concluded that the main reason Soviet forces were unable to destroy the Rzhev salient was underestimation of the rugged terrain and the shortage of supporting armor, artillery, mortars, and aircraft to pierce the enemy defenses. He also admitted he did not expect the Germans to bring up considerable reinforcements from other fronts. But that admission came decades later, in his memoirs. At the time, Operation Mars simply disappeared from Soviet historiography. It was buried beneath the triumphant narrative of Stalingrad, and Zhukov's role in it was carefully obscured to protect his reputation as a military genius. The Rzhev offensives exposed a crisis in Soviet logistics that helps explain the catastrophic casualties. During what soldiers called the ammunition famine at the Rzhev salient, the Red Army averaged just 3 bullets per rifle, 30 bullets per submachine gun, 300 bullets for each light machine gun, 600 for each heavy machine gun. Artillery faced similar shortages that crippled Soviet offensive capability. This desperate shortage forced Soviet commanders to use tanks as artillery, keeping them stationary to provide fire support rather than using them for mobile exploitation. This inappropriate employment sharply reduced armored effectiveness and prevented the kind of deep penetrations that could have unhinged German defenses. Tanks meant to exploit breakthroughs instead sat in place trading shells with German positions until they were destroyed. The contrast with Stalingrad was stark and revealing. Operation Uranus, the encirclement at Stalingrad, received 2.5 to 4.5 ammunition loads per gun. Operation Mars received less than 1 load per gun. The soldiers at Rzhev were expected to break through fortified positions, with a fraction of the resources allocated to the southern front. Some historians believe this disparity was intentional. According to NKVD agent Pavel Sudoplatov, Soviet intelligence deliberately leaked the plans for Operation Mars to the Germans as part of a deception operation codenamed Monastery. The goal was to fix German attention on the central sector, while the real blow fell at Stalingrad. A Soviet double agent named Alexander Demyanov, codenamed Haina, revealed information about a large-scale Soviet offensive in the Rzhev area to convince the Germans that the main attack would occur there. If this interpretation is correct, the soldiers at Rzhev were sacrificial lambs, sent to die in offensives that were designed to fail from the beginning. They were ammunition for a deception operation. Their deaths useful only insofar as they convinced the Germans to keep their reserves in the wrong place. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield and into the civilian population, trapped between the armies. When the Germans captured Rzhev in October 1941, the town held approximately 56,000 residents. Within months of occupation, the German authorities exported 9,000 civilians to Germany as forced laborers, torn from their homes and families. Another 9,000 were shot, tortured, or starved to death in a concentration camp that the Germans built in the center of the town itself. The fighting made everything worse. Soviet artillery and aircraft bombarded the German-held town relentlessly, destroying homes and killing civilians caught in the crossfire. The Germans used the remaining population as labor for their fortifications. Civilians dug trenches, built bunkers, and cleared fields of fire under the threat of execution. By the time Soviet forces finally entered Rzhev, the population had collapsed to just 362 people, from 56,000 to 362, an entire city essentially erased from existence. The German SS Regiment Der Führer exemplified the brutality of the defensive operations. Ordered to hold at all costs, they watched their ranks depleted from an original strength of around 3,000 men to just 650 in weeks of continuous fighting. At the village of Klepenino, 14 men and 28 wounded defended the ruins until only a single house remained standing. Only then did the order come to evacuate what was left of the position. Model himself issued the order that defined the battle: hold at all costs. At all costs. He repeated the words to ensure they were understood. There would be no voluntary withdrawals. Every position would be defended until the defenders were dead or the position was overrun. German battalions were reduced to shadows of their former strength. According to retired German General Horst Grossmann, who wrote a book about the battle, by August 31st, some German battalions had only one commander and 12 soldiers remaining, the equivalent of a single squad where there should have been 500 men. Artillery flashes lit up the night sky in what witnesses described as apocalyptic fury, turning night into day across miles of front line. Both sides bled together in the frozen swamps and burning villages. The ground became saturated with blood and bodies. Soviet writer Viktor Astafyev, who fought in the war, later captured the horror in a single sentence. "We flooded them with rivers of blood and covered them with mountains of corpses." The landscape itself bore witness to the slaughter. Craters from artillery shells overlapped until no untouched ground remained. Forests were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages that had stood for centuries became unrecognizable heaps of rubble. The dead lay where they fell, frozen in winter, decomposing in summer, impossible to retrieve under constant fire. Some soldiers used the bodies of their fallen comrades as cover, building makeshift parapets from corpses because they provided better protection than the waterlogged soil. Years after the war ended, and even into the present day, the bones of Red Army soldiers are still being found in the forests and swamps around Rzhev. Search parties continue to discover remains, identify them when possible, and give them proper burials decades after they fell. The earth itself became a mass grave that is still yielding its dead. In March 1943, the Germans did what 14 months of Soviet offensives had failed to achieve. They simply decided to leave. Operation Bouffel was not a retreat forced by enemy pressure. It was a calculated strategic redeployment executed according to plan. The destruction of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad had changed the entire strategic situation on the Eastern Front. German forces desperately needed to establish stable defensive lines in the south. Holding the Rzhev salient was no longer worth the commitment of 29 divisions when those forces were desperately needed elsewhere. The withdrawal was planned and executed with ruthless German efficiency over the course of 2 weeks. 300,000 men, 100 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces were extracted from the salient with minimal casualties and no disruption of German defensive capabilities. The 9th Army retreated without serious losses and retained almost all of its equipment, but they left devastation in their wake that shocked even hardened Soviet soldiers when they finally advanced into the abandoned positions. Model personally ordered the deportation of all male civilians of military age from the evacuated territory. Wells were poisoned to deny water to advancing Soviet forces. At least 24 villages were completely razed, burned to the ground with everything in them. The Germans destroyed 1,000 kilometers of railway track to prevent Soviet pursuit. They cut 1,300 kilometers of communication wire. They laid 450 kilometers of new cable lines that were booby-trapped to explode when touched. Before leaving, the 9th Army conducted large-scale security sweeps under the doctrine of Bandenbekämpfung, meaning bandit fighting. An estimated 3,000 Russians were killed in these sweeps. The vast majority were unarmed, as revealed by the inventory of seized weapons, which listed only 277 rifles, 41 pistols, and 61 machine guns. They were massacring civilians under the pretense of anti-partisan operations. The official Soviet report published on April 7, 1943, documented the scorched earth in devastating detail. In Vyazma, only 51 small houses remained, standing out of 5,500 buildings. In Gzhatsk, 300 out of 1,600. In Rzhev itself, 500 out of 5,400. 15,000 people had been deported from these three towns alone as slave laborers for the German war economy. In the Sikevka region, 137 villages out of 248 had been burned to the ground. British war correspondent Alexander Wirth visited the area soon after liberation and saw the results of Model's orders with his own eyes. The Soviet report listed Model at the top of the war criminals responsible for what it called a deliberate extermination policy. The withdrawal liberated 22 of the 29 divisions that had been defending the salient. 22 experienced, organized, combat-ready divisions became available exactly when Germany needed them most. These freed divisions would stabilize the German front after the catastrophic losses at Stalingrad. They would establish new defensive lines where the southern front had collapsed. They would provide the strategic flexibility that prevented a complete German collapse in the winter of 1943. The Germans shortened their front lines by 230 kilometers, creating a more compact and defensible position while simultaneously gaining a powerful mobile reserve. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most accomplished panzer commanders, questioned the wisdom of this decision. He doubted whether it made sense to abandon the strategically important Rzhev-Vyazma salient in order to gather troops for what he characterized as a less valuable objective at Kursk. Guderian's skepticism proved remarkably prescient. Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk that summer, would fail catastrophically, consuming German armored forces without achieving any strategic breakthrough. But whether Guderian was right or wrong about the strategic calculus, his doubts crystallized the central tragedy of Rzhev. Even German commanders recognized they were voluntarily surrendering something valuable, something the Soviets had proven completely unable to capture by force despite 14 months of trying and over 2 million casualties. The casualty figures from the Rzhev campaign defy comprehension when examined closely. According to Russian historian A.V. Isayev, Soviet losses from January 1942 to March 1943 were 392,555 killed in action and 768,233 wounded or sick. But these official figures account for only 8 of the 15 months of fighting, covering only the 4 named offensive operations, and omitting the constant smaller attacks and defensive losses in between. Historian Svetlana Gerasimova calculated that when the missing 7 months of casualties are included, total Soviet losses approach 2.3 million men killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Marshal V.G. Kulikov, who participated in the battles himself, named an approximate figure for total Soviet casualties on the Rzhev Bulge: 2,060,000 people. German losses were substantial, but far smaller in comparison. Records show 162,613 killed, 35,650 missing, and 469,747 wounded across the armies involved. Combined German casualties of roughly 670,000 men. The exchange ratio was devastating for the Soviets. For every German casualty, approximately 3 Soviet soldiers died or were wounded. In some of the offensive operations, the ratio was even worse. During the early 1942 operations, 25.7% of all Soviet soldiers who participated were killed on the battlefield. More than 1 in 4 men sent into those attacks never came back. The question that haunts historians is simple. Why does no one remember Rzhev? The Soviet government had powerful reasons to bury this history. The battle represented failure on a massive scale. Zhukov's reputation as a military genius was at stake, and he was far too important to Soviet mythology to be associated with such a catastrophe. Commemorating Rzhev would raise uncomfortable questions about strategic decision-making. It would highlight the cost of Stalin's obsessive focus on the Moscow axis. It would reveal offensives that may have been designed to fail as part of deception operations. The battle lacks the dramatic narrative elements that capture historical imagination. Stalingrad had the encirclement of an entire German army, the urban combat in the ruined city, the final surrender of Field Marshal Paulus. Kursk had the massive tank battles, the technological competition between German and Soviet armor. Rzhev had none of these advantages. It was simply a meat grinder. It consumed millions. It achieved nothing. When Russian television aired a documentary called Rzhev, Marshal Zhukov's Unknown Battle in 2009, it sparked public controversy and even calls for the arrest of those involved in its production. German veterans interviewed in the documentary described the Red Army's attacks as using Soviet troops as little more than cannon fodder. The criticism struck too close to truths that official history preferred to bury. As British journalist Adrian Blomfield wrote, "The name Rzhev should resound in the consciousness of Russians in the same way that the Somme does for Britons. This cataclysmic death toll was largely the result of Stalin's disdain for the lives of his own men and the atrocious bungling of Soviet commanders. Yet most Russians know little of the Rzhev battles because they have largely been airbrushed from official history. Only the poet Alexander Tvardovsky managed to capture the loss in words that survived Soviet censorship. His poem, I Was Killed, near Rzhev, spoke from beyond the grave in the voice of an unknown soldier lost in the swamps. I was killed near Rzhev, in a nameless bog, in 5th Company, on the left flank, in a cruel air raid. I could hear no explosion. I could see no bright flash of light, as if into a chasm. I just vanished from sight. And this wide world all over, till it comes to its end, not a shred of my tunic, not a button will be found. I am where the blind roots seek for food in the dark. I am where the rye and the dust clouds sway upon the high ground." The poem continued with a message to the living. I bequeath you to live. What more can I do? I bequeath you to be happy in your life over there, and to serve your motherland with honor for long. When in sorrow, be proud. Do not bend down your head. When rejoicing, do not boast in the victory hour, and to safeguard, brothers, this victory, the happiness of yours, in the memory of your warrior brother who has fallen for it. In June 2020, Vladimir Putin unveiled a memorial outside Rzhev, a 25-meter bronze sculpture of a Soviet soldier standing on a mound, his lower body transforming into a flock of 35 cranes. The cranes symbolize the souls of dead soldiers from one of the most heartfelt Russian songs about the war. On a marble slab with a wreath, Tvardovsky's words are inscribed, "We perished for the motherland, but she is saved." The battles of the Rzhev Salient killed more men than many famous campaigns combined. They lasted longer than most remembered battles of the Second World War. They achieved less than almost any major operation on either side. The dagger pointed at Moscow was never driven home by German forces. The threat Zhukov described never materialized into actual offensive action. The Germans were not capable of launching a major operation toward the Soviet capital in 1942. Their strategic priority was the Caucasus oil fields, not Moscow. The obsession that drove 14 months of offensives was based on fear of what might happen, rather than clear analysis of what would happen. And in the end, the Germans simply left. They walked away from positions the Soviets had bled for over a year to capture. They gained strategic advantage from the withdrawal while leaving behind poisoned wells, burned villages, mass graves, and the bones of 2 million casualties scattered across the swamps and forests. History prefers victories and defeats to monuments of futility. Stalingrad achieved victory. Kursk broke German offensive power. Rzhev achieved nothing but casualties. The dagger pointed at Moscow was withdrawn by the hand that held it. The fortress that consumed 2 million casualties was evacuated by German choice. The year-long battle ended not with Soviet victory, but with German strategic redeployment. Rzhev stands as the ultimate monument to the futility of obsessive strategic focus, the terrible cost of attritional warfare, and the tragedy of casualties suffered for objectives that prove meaningless. It remains forgotten because remembering would require confronting the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the greatest battles achieve absolutely nothing. 2 million casualties, 14 months of continuous combat, and in the end, positions surrendered voluntarily by an enemy who simply decided they were no longer worth holding. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.